Growing your business can mean big-time logistical questions, like how are we going to keep up with all these local deliveries? Let Uber Direct offer you a helping hand. With Uber Direct, you take orders on your website, app, or by phone. Then, drivers who are part of Uber's courier network pick them up from your store and deliver them to your customer's doorstep. Sounds simple, right? Delivery just got better with Uber Direct. Learn more at uberdirect.com.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hey guys, did you watch the Olympics this year? Now, aside from the amazing feats that the great athletes do you ever think what kind of dedication and workouts they have to do to reach that level? Now, how about the equine events? Of course, we always hear about the rider's name, but do you ever really pay attention to the horse's name? Or do you ever think about the training they, not the rider, the horse has to do? Now again, I want you to carry it through like you're thinking about humans. Horses are athletes too, and not to belittle the riders, but let's celebrate the horse's accomplishment. Now in today's episode, Roly Owers, he's the chief executive of World Horse Welfare, he joins me. Roly has this extensive, diverse background. Not only is he a horseman himself, but he's a veterinarian and he's done a plethora of many other things. Now he goes into detail how World Horse Welfare protects and sets standards for these amazing athletes. They use a combination of care, research, education, and influence. And by doing so, they improve the lives and standards of care for these beautiful beings. Roly delves into the history of World Horse Welfare. And what a history they've had. Their founder, Ada Cole's story is of this woman who was way ahead of her time and the perseverance she had to set. And by doing so, she created this solid foundation for this great organization. So put on your riding boots and pants and hang on for an amazing ride. We're going to go down the history and future of World Horse Welfare.
For real, for real, for real, for real. For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and games from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the For Real podcast. Today I've got somebody from across the pond, at least from here, Roly Owers. I hope I pronounced that right, with the World Horse Welfare Organization. Roly's got a huge history in the equine world, and we're just really privileged to have you. Roly, welcome to the show, and I can't wait to get into the story of what you guys are doing, and also your story as well.
Mark, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to speak to you today, so thank you for the invitation.
Well, so I think it's more of a privilege for me, and I know you have a busy schedule, and I really do appreciate it. Can we start off? We'll get into the organization here in a second, but let's talk about you. You've got a huge background in equine world, but let's kind of get you to where you are today, and then let's talk about the organization. We're going to talk about sport and that, which is obviously always a good area for me, but let's start with you. So let's talk from a kid. Obviously, you're an animal person, so let's just go from there and see where it takes us.
Yeah, I guess my parents, like so many, were such driving forces behind my sort of love of the world and love of nature and love of animals. And so I was put on a horse or a pony when I was 2 years old. And I rode, I have two elder brothers, and rather uniquely, we rode as a team of three quite often. So three boys riding together. I'm not sure what it's like in the US, but it's still quite unusual in the UK because obviously at most ages, there's a lot more girls, a lot more females in the sport. So that was a great fun, really enjoyed it. And through that, I always had an interest. At school, I was better at sciences than I was at the arts. And therefore, going a veterinary route was one that I thought about when I was actually quite young, about 12. And I followed that through. And so I graduated as a vet. And, the thing about studying a vet, it's 5 or 6 years. So it takes quite a long time. And I wasn't necessarily sure I had a complete vision of where I was going to go after I was going to be a vet, but I knew that I really wanted to be a vet from quite a young age.
Well, I've never known what I wanted to do, so you were a lot better than me for sure. But I always find it interesting when I talk to people that were veterinarians that they've always had that level of animals for the most part, 99% of them in there. But it's kind of an interesting journey. Here when you talk about equine, you're right. It's mainly, matter of fact, I don't know of any guys that I've grew up with or around that were equine sports. Of course, I'm in Texas and we got a bunch of cowboys out here, but we don't have the equine people, and it's girls. And I think it'd be pretty cool. I have two brothers as well, of us riding around. That would have been a really cool thing. So, when you were doing that and growing up, are your brothers are they doing anything in the sports world, doing equine? Or are they doing veterinarian? What are they doing?
Yeah, they could be completely different paths. One's a solicitor, lawyer, and one's a physio, human physio. Although there's quite a bit in the sports world on that, but they took different paths to me.
Yeah. Well, so what I think is really cool about your path, though, is you were in the veterinarian, but you also you did a bunch of stuff in the military too. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because, here in the US, anybody that's been over to London, of course, we've seen the guys on the horses and all that kind of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about that for the guests that are my audience here in the US? We've had people all over the world, but here I think it would be interesting for us.
Sure. I mean, as I said, I went through my long veterinary training, and I didn't necessarily have a clear idea of what that next step would be. But during that time, I was aware that the British Army had the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, and at the end of the First World War, there was nearly 3,000 vets in the British Army. And fast forward to the early 90s, and there was less than 30.
Wow.
But they were recruiting that year. And actually, since that time, the number has gone up. But they were recruiting that year. And so I thought, well, actually, it's a great opportunity for me because it married together lots of things. The animals in the army that you generally treat are horses, which are there for ceremonial purposes, and the canines, the dogs, which were there for working purposes. But it also allowed me, I'd got into the charity world as a volunteer in a very small way at college. And so I wanted to try and carry that on. And it seemed to be a way of marrying those two together. So, when I graduated, I spent a small time, about 5-6 months working for a small animal charity here in the UK called the Blue Cross. It's quite a well-known one. And then I joined the army, and I did that for 7 years. And in my time, I spent a year out in Northern Ireland. At that stage, the troubles were still going on in Northern Ireland, and therefore there was a significant military presence, and there was a lot of dogs over there as a result. And then I came over, and I had 3 years at the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment in London, which was a real eye-opener for me in so many different ways. Then I did a staff job up in Leicestershire, in the middle of the country, which was a depot of dogs. So all the horses and dogs that came into the military came through the depot in Leicestershire. So I got and I was also lucky enough to do a master's degree, supported to do a master's degree whilst I was within the military. So I really enjoyed it. If I wanted to go to the top of the tree to be a vet, in terms of career path, that probably wouldn't have been the route to go, because you don't get the caseload going through, but you get so many different experiences.
When I think everything when it comes to world experiences too, it actually makes you better. Even if you didn't get the caseload, having those world experiences maybe makes you look at things differently. And obviously where you are now, obviously it did. So, the path is an interesting path.
No, you said you didn't know earlier about what you wanted to do in the future. And I've often thought my career is a sort of a river as it nears the coast. It sort of meanders along and doesn't quite know where it's going, but it's going to go through some interesting territory along the way. And I think that was the classic example of just that.
I think people that work in the charity world, I do a lot of volunteer work in conflict zones and stuff like that. I think it's always ingrained you just don't know it. And as your life experiences happen, it just kind of percolates and comes up to the surface, and it takes you to where we are today. Everybody, I think, in a weird sort of way.
Too true. Yeah.
So let's talk about where you are today, and let's talk about the organization. How did you end up with these guys? and then let's dig into Ada Cole and how she got that started and go from there.
So I had a mutual friend who was working at what was then called the International League for the Protection of Horses. And I worked for them for that was my first job when I came out of the military. And there I developed I had a bit of a fundraising background, and I took on a fundraising role there. And that was a really sort of different walk of life. I temporarily at that stage sort of parked my veterinary work and thought I'd give that a crack. And I just absolutely loved it. And so people often ask me, are you very sad to give up your clinical veterinary work? And I go, yeah, I was. It's not something I did lightly, but, I've really enjoyed different paths I've taken since. But also now in the role, I'm not doing clinical work, but that veterinary background in a lot of the work we do now around lobbying and policy work, my veterinary background has really, really helped. So I did 4 years, and then I went away to do another fundraising role for 4 years. And then I was just lucky enough that the chief exec role at a charity was coming up. They decided they were changing their name from ILPH, or the International League for Protection of Horses, to World Horse Welfare. And that was in 2008, and I've never left. And I'm acutely aware that it's a natural human condition to sort of naturally sort of move towards the centre ground and take the safe route, because if you're not in a new job or role, you're not necessarily challenging yourself. So I'm always looking to challenge myself to making sure I'm really thinking with that wider view, as opposed to someone who's been there for a few years and feels like, we've tried that, it didn't work, so we won't try again. So, but I love it, and partly because of the breadth of the organisation's work. Every single day is different, and never do I wake up and think, "Oh God, we've got to do that again." It's something different, and that energises me. And of course, I have a wonderful team that I work with, and they energise. Hopefully, we energise each other, and it's a great place to work.
Well, let's get into what you guys do. And, I'm glad you changed the name, because that was a mouthful beforehand. That was a long name to remember. And I think your name now is more definitive, World Welfare Horse Organization. So let's talk about the history of it. Let's go back to the Ada Cole when she started. She's an interesting woman. I read her bio, and that's crazy.
Yeah.
And then to what you're doing now, because you guys it's worldwide, you're a worldwide charity, but you're covering a lot of different bases when it comes to horses and donkeys or equines, let's just use that word. But let's talk about the history and how you got to where you are today. And, based on what I read, you've evolved and continue to evolve in a really good way. So let's talk about that.
Sure, Mark. If you look at us today, there's broadly 4 areas of activity that we undertake. And the first one, which is campaigning, we were born as a campaigning organisation. Our founder, and as you've mentioned, she was an extraordinary woman. And she witnessed British workhorses being exported to France and Belgium for slaughter. And these were horses that have worked all their life, agricultural animals, so worked all their lives on the farmland. And then at the end of their useful life, they were packaged off to these slaughterhouses. And the conditions in which they were transported were simply abysmal. And the conditions in which they were slaughtered were simply abysmal. And Ada, she fought for many years. In fact, she started it before the Great War, the First World War. But obviously the live export trade stopped during the war because so many horses were involved in that war. But in the 20s, it started getting going again. And so in 1927, she set up what actually was then called the International League Against the Export of Horses for Butchery, which is even more of a mouthful and very graphic. But it really shows our campaigning roots. And she campaigned to make it illegal to export equines to slaughter. Now, in her lifetime, she didn't achieve that, but she put in train an organisation that would eventually achieve that. So that campaigning piece is very much at the heart of what we do. The long distance transport of horse for slaughter, fundamentally initially in Europe, but now spreading more worldwide, is still very much a galvanizing issue for the organisation. And we're nearly 100 years old. That makes us. We're centenary in 2027. and our values and the approach of the organization. We view ourselves as a caring, pragmatic, and forward-thinking organization. And that's what Ada Cole was. So it's very much in her image, because how she set up the organization with such enthusiasm and energy and focus is still very much what drives us today.
Well, Sheena, the thing that I found interesting, she's like a modern woman today, almost based on her values. In fact, in one of the things I read too, that she was a vegetarian, which, I don't know that they had many back in those times,
Yeah.
but she was so forward thinking. And can you imagine what a force she'd be today? I mean, it's crazy.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why, and it's that energy, that example is really much what, as we build towards our centenary, we really want to sort of try tap into that, because you say an extraordinary, a woman that was completely out of her times in many ways, very modern person, and that's really, as we go into our second century, we want her to help her and her memory and her guidance to really sort of fuel that. And so that's a really exciting for us, and being able to sort of focus it so much around our founder, I think is really important to our identity.
You alluded to it, and I'm going to describe it a little bit more, because she was in Antwerp, I think, is when she first saw that. And, what resonated with me is she saw these beaten down animals that had worked their entire life, that had traveled there, and just some of them couldn't even walk. And, she just couldn't believe how these animals had given back to the humans, because your big deal is horse to human welfare, basically, and really making people more aware that these guys have been supporting us. What are we doing to them, regardless of where they were going, but at least give them some dignity, I guess is a good word.
And dignity is very much a word she used. And it was the fact that, interestingly, even though personally she didn't eat meat, she didn't campaign against, and the easiest thing would have been to campaign against people eating horse meat.
Sure.
Actually, certainly from a British perspective, and from many sort of perspectives, we don't eat or haven't traditionally eaten horse meat. But she didn't do that. She said our responsibility is to these animals in their lifetime, and our responsibility is to treat them with care and compassion until the end of their days. And so she actually lobbied to have a equine slaughterhouse established in the UK, in England,
Mm-hmm.
so that these animals did not have to make these horrific journeys. And of course, when we talk about end of life with our animals, any animal, it's a very sensitive and emotional thing. But the world over, slaughter is an option for many horses. And so it is where it is done. It's so important it's done in a stress-free way as possible, and follows regulations where there are regulations. So it is a really sort of sensitive issue. But her drive, and still to our drive today, is very much, as you say, that horse-human relationship. And it's so important that we fulfill our side of the relationship until the end of every equine's days. Once they're dead, they're dead. But during their lifetime, it's our responsibility to make sure we protect their welfare.
Well, I mean, in today's time, and I think more so than every year it's different, becomes better. But it's just respecting animals, because now they're a lot more. They're part of our lives, and it blows my mind that kindness is an easy thing to do if you actually make the effort to be kindness. And when you recognize whatever animal is doing for you, giving a bit of kindness to them and supporting them makes all the sense in the world to me.
Absolutely. And, compassion, care, compassion. And that's where the whole issue about welfare is so important, but also very close aligned to welfare is ethics. And ethics is about, that's not a scientific judgment. That's a moral judgment. And that's
right.
Your ethics and my ethics could be different.
Right.
But it's so important that we ask ourselves, should I, before we say, can I? So we can do a lot of things with our animals, with our horses, But the ethical question is to challenge ourselves, say, should I be doing it? Is it the right thing to be doing?
Right.
And obviously, ethically, sometimes we do come up short, and that's something that we really do try and challenge ourselves. I think that's especially when we come on to talk about it is important within the horse sports space. But very briefly, if I might, Mark, obviously I've talked about our campaigning work. The second area of our work is we broadly call responsible ownership. And the reality is that horses, equines the world over, often suffer neglect and poor care because of owner ignorance, owner misunderstanding, sometimes owner cruelty. But usually, by the vast majority of the time, it's ignorance. And therefore, we have this big focus around sort of responsible ownership. In the UK, that we have a sort of an intervention element to that, where we run the largest rescue and rehoming scheme for equines in the country. We have 4 centres around the country, total capacity of about 320, 340 horses. We take in 300 to 400 horses every year, and we rehome 300 to 400 horses every year. And we've got about not far short of 2,500 equines in homes around the country. So that's a really resource-intensive big part of what we do. But outside that sort of intervention piece, we're increasingly trying to focus on the prevention. And therefore, because ignorance is such a driver of poor equine care, trying to improve education. And in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in the US and other countries, there's lots of formal education, lots of college education and formal, but actually we very much focus on the informal, trying to provide that real practical guidance to horse owners. So that responsible ownership piece is the second area of our work. The third area, and you mentioned obviously we're a worldwide organisation, and we currently work in 20 countries where we've got 22 projects, because bizarre as it may seem, many of us think of equines as sport and leisure animals, but the vast majority out of the 130 odd million equines in the world today are still working animals. They're still supporting people's livelihoods in low and middle income countries, across Central and Latin America, across Africa, across Asia, especially Southeast Asia. So, there's many parts where equines still very much are powering people's lives. And so we work in a lot of these communities, again, with that frontline care element of our work, but where education and increasingly research is being a focus for us to build that evidence base. And of course, then the fourth area is, as far as I'm aware, we're the only equine welfare organisation worldwide to actually support the responsible use of horses in sport. And so that's I know we'll come on to talk about that, but that hopefully gives us sort of an overview of what World Horse Welfare, 98 years into our operations, what we're all about.
One of the things that I like about your website, and it resonated with me, is you use the word practical all the time, making practical decisions. I've spent a lot of time with nonprofits all over the world doing a bunch of different things, and also talked to a lot of animal rescue things. And oftentimes, while well-intentioned, if I can get those words out correctly, well-intentioned aren't always practical, because, one of the things that wherever we're raised, we look at things differently. So you have to incorporate the culture of wherever the animal is. And sometimes cultures are different and that comes back to your word using ethics. Morality is one thing. Ethics is a different thing. And ethics is defined by how you're raised. So, it's one of those things. Sometimes, even though we're well-intentioned, we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, a practical, a vision of what that is.
Absolutely. And again, coming back to Ada Cole, our founder, we believe she was a really practical lady or person. And, that very much drives us. And, the statement I often love to use is, don't let excellence be the enemy of the good. Perfection doesn't really exist. We live in a world where there are risks. We live in a world where people are not perfect, and therefore you've got to live it in that context. And interestingly, the way you talked about it there, Mark, I mean, the fact is that millions and millions of horses across the world and donkeys and mules are still used as working animals. many people were thinking in an ideal world that they shouldn't be used in that way. But the fact is that's the world we live
Right.
in 2024, and we might want to look to move to a world where it was different, but it's going to be years, decades, if ever, for that change. So we really want to make a difference to animals' lives today, now, as well as trying to improve the context, the policy, the legislation, and people's understanding going forward. So it's a matter of that short, medium, and long term, and that's the practical way. And we really do passionately believe that's the right way and the way we can really help horses.
Well, I'm guessing you guys have kind of figured out the formula, and I know it's always evolving. You've been around for almost 100 years, so you're doing something right.
Well, thank you for saying so. I mean, we've obviously evolved, and we talked about we started as a campaigning organisation. We took on our first rescue and rehoming centre here in the UK in 1949. We started our international work in the mid 80s, and since the mid 80s, we've evolved that work within the horse sport world. So yeah, absolutely, it's changing and evolving, but so is the world, and the challenge of what we faced in 1927. There's some similarities, but obviously there's quite a lot of differences in 2024, and then it's so important we change too.
So let's get into one of the things we had talked about talking about talking about. If I can only speak like I speak like an American, clearly not like I'm British. We had talked about equine sport animals and the relationship to them and the welfare of them. So let's dig into that because I've got several questions. I've read some stuff, and of course, through whatever little knowledge I have. So let's just go into that. And obviously, we just had the Olympics, which had equine sports there, and I don't know that is it called eventing, the one that's kind of like where it's almost like a cross country thing that they were doing. I'm not an equine guy, so you're gonna have to forgive me. I've never worn those tight pants or anything like that. So let's talk a little bit about that and go from there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, the Olympics is on the global stage.
Sure.
There's three equestrian disciplines. One's called dressage. People often call it dancing horses. One's called jumping, where it can be indoor or outdoor, and they go around a jumping course, and the horse and the obstacles can be knocked over. So obviously that creates penalties. And there's one that puts them all together called eventing, which starts with dressage, the dancing bit, then the cross country element, and then the jumping piece at the end. So, and it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of skill to be able to get to the Olympics. But of course, that's just the very pinnacle of the pyramid. Underneath that pyramid, at the foundations, there are hundreds of thousands of millions of horses, ponies competing across the world. And our stance, very much the World Horse Welfare stance, is that, responsible horse sport is an asset, is a positive for people, but it can also be a positive for horses. But that's only the case if we are putting their welfare at the centre. And this is especially relevant when we come back to the ethics, because there's so many decisions we make in terms of how we train our horses, the veterinary interventions that our horses have along the way. And it's so important that we really are asking that question with the thoughts of what is best for the horse at the center of what we do.
Well, you'd said this earlier, and I kind of jumped it because I was thinking about it while you were talking about it, is education. Really, a lot of it comes down to education. That's across the board in any animal world, is learning. Some people just don't know. So I know you're educating. And how are you going about educating them? And again, I want to stay on the sports side of it for now because I just find it interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two aspects to this. One is that our understanding of what constitutes good equine welfare is changing. And so when I was training at veterinary school, there was a lot of talk about equine health and there's a lot of talk about equine welfare, but it was mainly physical welfare. And so, when we think about, our own situations and, when we think about what makes a good life for us, yes, being in physical contentment is a really important part of that. But equally, if not more important, is our mental state of mind, and that becomes especially relevant in today's world. But that's exactly the same for horses. Actually, what really counts for sentient beings, whether they're people, horses, or dogs, or any other animal, is the fact that actually their mental experiences, their mental feelings, is actually what's really driving their perception of whether they're having a good life, a life that's just worth living, or indeed a life that's not worth living. And so it's really important that we, and I include vets, riders, owners, everyone in this, the fact that we have to constantly strive to improve our understanding, to improve our knowledge, because there is more education, there's more research coming out all the time. And there's some really practical examples of that we could come on to. But then outside that piece around educating and informing ourselves, and where needed, changing the way we do things with our horses as a result of that new knowledge, we also live in a world, with the digital world, the social media world, where everyone is watching, everyone has a view. And that wasn't the case only 10 years ago, because actually the equestrian world could largely get on, except on the big race days and the big Olympic days, get on, with no one watching what they were doing. Now those days are over. And it's not just because people are watching, because as I said, it's ethically, the right thing to do. But we do now have a growing call of people who do not believe it's right to utilize or use horses in sport, for leisure, for anything. And, actually, we've got to make sure that we really are telling the story of how we are caring for our horses, how we are putting their welfare at the center of what we do, and actually how that horse-human relationship can really be a beneficial one both ways. And you can't just assume people will know that. We've got to be much better at telling it. And along the way, where people fall foul of the rules, we've got to be much better at being very clear that we find that we view that unacceptable, and there are consequences for people who do try to cut corners or break the rules.
So how do you get that message out? Do you guys do like conferences, or how are you doing that?
Yeah, so we have worked with welfare regulators across the world for around 30 to 40 years now. And when it comes to the horse sport world, that's much easier, because you have the International Equestrian Federation, then is the FEI. It's based in Switzerland, but it covers horse sport. Obviously, it's responsible for the Olympics, for the World Equestrian Games, and all the major national championships. Or regional championships, sorry. And so we've had an interaction with the FEI and been their welfare advisors for over 40 years. We have worked with a lot of the national federations, clearly with the British Equestrian Federation, but also last year I was at the annual meeting of the United States Equestrian Federation. So we are increasingly working with national federations and the FEI. On the racing side, that's a bit more challenging. We have a very close relationship. Our welfare advisors to the British Horse Racing Authority have a lot to do in Australia and Hong Kong, and to some degree in the US as well. And obviously the establishment of the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Agency Authority, HISA, has been a significant step in the racing world. So working with these kind of institutions is a key way where we seek to work with them to get this message across.
Well, I read something about, in the racing world at least, and I don't know, it could be the U.S. what I read, but 2023 was the safety of the racing horses had really improved. So I was wondering, I'm sure some of that has to do with your impact, and I'm sure there's a specific, like that organization mentioned. But are you seeing big changes like that? I know that they said there was like 1.2 something per thousand fatalities in the racing world, which was lower than it had ever been since they'd been measuring it.
Yes, I think there are. Obviously, there are some individually, and Santa Anita Racecourse, for example, has been over the last few years in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. So I think there is a lot of work going on in that area to try and make it as safe as possible. Clearly, there are a number of key issues there, one of which is to making sure you have a clean sport. So horses that are racing or competing are doing so not under medical influence. Just like doping in human athletes is unacceptable, and it's unacceptable in equine athletes.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because
Yeah.
one of the things I read about drugs were legal and non-legal, the use of drugs too. And I was wondering what the legal drugs because they do them, especially in these young horses that are breaking their legs or whatever. What is the legal drugs that they're doing? I saw some, and that may not have a meaning to you, but if it does, I was just curious when I was reading it.
Yeah, so I mean, anti-inflammatories are an easy one to start with.
Sure.
Different jurisdictions will have different views around whether horses can compete with anti-inflammatories. Our view is very clear that they shouldn't be able to. You shouldn't be propping up horses because you're putting them and the rider at risk. And that it's different, possibly at very lower level competition. But once you're getting to any kind of significant level of competition, there should be a zero tolerance approach to it. Another issue that's very live, certainly within US racing, is the use of diuretics to try and prevent horses bleeding. Through in their lungs and out through their nostrils. And again, that the US is increasingly becoming isolated in the allowance of that drug. So, when you look across the world, there is this move towards a drug-free sport, and that can only be a good thing. And indeed, we would say that's an absolute prerequisite, because that when you're talking about what do we mean by responsible horse sport, well, we would very clearly say that responsible horse sport is drug-free horse sport.
So, what's your opinion? And it'll be your opinion. That way, we're not getting ourselves in trouble. Why is the U.S. isolating? Is it just money?
Well, I think there's a lot of heritage in these things, and things have been changing. And I would hate to because I know that within the U.S. there is many different jurisdictions. HISA, this authority that is a federal authority, so obviously covers all the 50 states, is certainly a step forward. But even before, there were some more, I would say, more enlightened states that were taking a more progressive attitude. And so I think there is a heritage, there is a history of why things have been done. And what we have come to realize now is that you can have the best case for change possible, but unless you can change people's behaviors, unless people really believe it, they're not going to change.
Right.
And therefore, bringing people with you and engaging what we call now behavioral change science, what really can help you drive that change in a positive way is so important. Because yes, you can come down from on top, a regulator can come down and say, we're going to do it this way. And that can sometimes work, and sometimes it has to be done like that. But actually, to get true sustainable change, you really do need to bring people with you, and that does take time.
For real, for real, for real, for real, for real, for real, for real.
And we'll be right back. We are supported by PrepVet, providing stem cell therapy for pets.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at PrepVet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
Something interesting I'm thinking while you're talking. I had an interview with Gray 2K, their big anti-greyhound racing organization.
Yeah.
And here in the U.S., we've almost eliminated it, but where it's the biggest in the world is on your side of the pond, which is Ireland and England and, Australia, British thing, but it's bigger there than it is anywhere else. I'm sure they're working against that too, showing just saying there's a good correlation there because of how they mistreat these animals and all this kind of stuff too, just to have the racing world. It's funny. You would think it'd be reverse on both ends. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, well, that's just, again, it's sort of the quirk of sort of cultural changes, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think mentioning the greyhound example, and especially within racing, it is so important now, and different jurisdictions, and certainly within the British perspective, are significantly improving it. We've got to be driven by data. We've got to be driven by the evidence. And we know within horse racing, within horse sport, there are always going to be risks, and we can never reduce those risks to zero.
Sure.
So, that sort of fatality free, horses injure themselves very easily in field. So we've got to take this stance of how can we reduce that number as far as possible, and to be able to do that, and we call it the avoidable risk. How do you minimize and bring that avoidable risk to zero? Well, you need the evidence to be able to do that. You need to have that data from every single race course across the year, year in, year out. And none of the answer's often not easy. If it was easy, it had been done long ago. But it doesn't mean you can't constantly strive to create that evidence base where you can make changes which makes racing safer, which makes horse sport safer. And I think that's a really important parallel. And it's equally true for greyhound racing.
I was sitting there thinking too, when you look at horse sport, and that would be across the whole spectrum, is one of your part of your programs based on almost physicality? Like as a human, we train to be athletes and we get in our best condition. And that is part of your, protection of these animal welfare. Is it, diet? Is there other trainings that you try to get these people there so they can have support better on their legs, or is anything like that? I don't know. I'm asking you because I have zero idea.
No, there's quite a lot of research being done by different institutions, because you're absolutely right. To have the best sport animals, you need to start right at the very beginning. You need to breed the best animals. You then need to care for them the best and give them the best early life experiences and follow on through. When we talk about equine welfare, obviously horse sport is one part of what we do, but a large part of what we're doing is speaking to the day-to-day horse owner, and I certainly include myself in that, in terms of how we can improve and protect their welfare to the best of our abilities. And there's some really interesting tools coming available now, and there's something called the 5 domains, which is the 5 domains which make up the welfare state of the animal. And one of those is nutrition.
Really?
So actually having good nutrition, and obviously that's nutrition and water, and how they're accessing that is really, really important. And that's very true, especially true in the younger days of the horse, their physical development in their younger days, just like it is with many other animals, and very much through their lives too. So yes, it is. But this is where we're coming back to trying to provide that practical guidance to horse owners of how they can best care for their horses.
And again, so you use organizations that you work directly with the organizations, but do you guys do any hands-on with big horse farms or things like that? Or is it mainly through the organizations and then they have and you train them to train them, I guess?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we have the 4 centres in England and Scotland,
right,
where we take in animals that have suffered abuse and neglect and turn them around. But there are other organisations within the UK that will have membership schemes and standards for some of the riding schools. And obviously riding schools in the UK are under regulation as well. There's a requirement for them to meet standards set by the government. But we are working very much through an education and influencing space, trying to, driven by the research we undertake and the research that others undertake, to provide practical guidance that we can deliver to horse owners, but also to organisations too, but then to do as much as we can around influencing people to change their behaviour where they need to. So it's a real sort of mix there of how we're trying to make a difference, because on the basis that that we care for individual animals in our farms, but if we are, and that we over the year we can impact tens and hundreds and even thousands of horses in that way, but we're never going to get to the 130 or 40 million horses around the world. So that's why actually having that influencing aspect informed by education and our research is really going to potentially have a far greater impact on a far larger proportion of the world's equines. And that's so it's having that mixture that is so important.
So I would assume there's a big government legislation arm of you guys too, working with to get regulation, and even in the third world countries that are using the horses, are you working with those countries to have, this is what you have to do, you can't do this, you get in trouble for doing that?
Yeah, we have campaigning is very much part of what we do. We have a very active engagement with the British government, and now within the UK we have the devolved administration, so there's government, because animal health and welfare is devolved to the individual countries, so Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. We've long had an association with the European Union, especially around the transport campaign, and through those countries that I mentioned earlier, we are working with government. What we have found in all countries is the fact that you can have the best legislation in the world, but unless you enforce it, it's worth nothing.
Right.
And that's the real challenge, because in most countries around the world, there is this real disconnect. You have the lawmakers, and they can be very good at creating laws,
sure,
but then the people who are there to enforce it either are uninformed, they don't have the money, or all sorts of reasons. They don't prioritize it. And so we do actively lobby, especially in the UK, but elsewhere, around trying to make that far more joined up, because that's so often where the problem is. There are laws there, it's just no one's enforcing them.
And they probably don't even know the laws are there half the time too, in third world countries in particular.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if you were to, for the people who are listening, if you were to give one message to everybody other than treat horses good, I mean, what would be the message that you would want the world to get out there, and how can they support you on what your guys are trying to do to make it a better horse-human world?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I suppose be open-minded. That's really true when it comes to welfare. Welfare is not just our physical welfare, it's our mental well-being too, and that's even more important for horses. So it's really, the horse world, the world over, can be relatively conservative, so resistant to change. We need to change that, because we need to be very open-minded to change, because our understanding of our horses is changing all the time. And I think we should, with that, we can be really confident in that equine human relationship, because it's been with us for millennia. If we look after it, it'll be with us for many, many more years to come too. But there is an expectation from society that we look after our horse as well. And I think that's a really great challenge for us to have. But I think we need to be open-minded to change the way sometimes we've done things for years.
I'm going to set you up here. So here's a funny question. Well, it's not funny. It's a good question. Since you've been wearing those tight pants since you're a little kid as a horse guy, how have you evolved, and how have you changed? I'm sorry about that question, but I'm sure you have. So, looking back when you were riding with your three brothers, and I'm assuming, hopefully you guys are still riding together.
Yeah.
How have you progressed to have a different view than what you were when you were a child?
Well,
sorry.
I would like to think I am far more open-minded, but to give you a specific example, when I was growing up, the stables in which we had our horses, we thought that's a 5-star luxury hotel accommodation that we provide our horses, our ponies.
Right.
And I'm so proud of that. But now I realise that actually stabling our horses is not in the best interest of their welfare. Sometimes we have to do it, of course we have
to.
But actually, horses' natural environment is out at grass with their friends, with the freedom to forage for up to 17 hours a day. So actually, now we have a horse, and he doesn't have a stable. He's out 24/7 all year round. And so it's just a small example where what I thought was the best thing we were doing, and it was a really smart stable to creosote it and make it look really smart. It wasn't good. In hindsight, that's not what they need, and that's a wonderful example of how we can sort of, when it's cold outside, people will go and put a rug on their horse. Well, actually, often they don't need it, and it just fuels epidemics around equine obesity and all sorts of other things. So, we want to let horses be horses and people be people, and actually, we need to think like a horse thinks and not like a person thinks. And so that I don't know if that answers your question, Mark, but that's for me. When I look back, I think, God, there's quite a lot I did when I was growing up, which actually in today's world is not in the best interest of the horse.
I actually love that answer because, I mean, when you were younger, the best intentions were, I'm going to give him a nice little house and all that. And as humans, we don't always know. And, if we've got best intentions are always the best thing. But taking a step back and learning, I know the horse wants to hang out with his buddies
Yeah.
and hang out in the field. That makes all the sense in the world. And I love your answer.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I think it's a great answer because anybody listening, if again, it's perspective, right? And perception is reality sometimes, and until you actually kind of think in a bigger picture. I mean, if I was a horse, I'd really be out in the field cruising around, doing whatever, laying down on the ground and sleeping wherever I was. Matter of fact, I wish I could do that myself sometimes. At the end of the day.
Too true. Too true.
That's and I guess that's a good way we can segue in a second, but I guess the way to think about it is try to look at it differently and try to think of it as a horse. I may be thinking I'm doing the best thing, but really is that the best thing for my buddy out here, Mr. Ed?
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we can make decisions with the best intentions, but they are not in the best interest of the horse, and that can be difficult for us to accept. And making that change can be quite difficult. And of course, I completely understand that sometimes horses do have to be stabled, but we've got to think about, okay, they have to be stable sometimes, but how can we make sure that we often call it the free F smart, the friends, freedom, and forage. That's what horses, from an evolutionary perspective, where they've come from. And we need to every day be able to think about how we can best provide that for our horses. So it's not always easy. But just because it's easy doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge ourselves to meet it.
Friends, freedom, and forage. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so for everybody that's listening, how do they find you guys on social media, your website? Can you give all that information so people can find you? Of course, I'll have it in the description if people want to get there, and I'll have some social media out there myself. But can you just let for the people listening that won't go there how they can find you?
The best place is to come to our website, which is www.worldhorsewelfare.org. And through there, we are widely out on social media, on Facebook, on TikTok and Instagram. And we're at Horse Charity. At Horse Charity is our tag. And info at worldhorsewelfare.org is the email address that comes straight into us. So, as I say, either email us direct, go to our website, or contact us through any of our social media channels, all of which are relatable through our website. And we are an organisation that relies on charitable support. So any support people can give, or any questions that people have, please do get in contact.
And by the way, for you guys who are listening, if you don't have the economics to do it, you can spread the word.
Yeah.
That's the other thing too, because that's what they're trying to do. I've noticed you guys like 3 letters, WWWFFF. The FFF here in the States, that's the worst grade. I usually have more than 3 FFFs, but anyway, that's what I had. So I sent you this. I hadn't asked you. At the end of every episode, I always do a silly animal joke. Do you have one, or you want me to tell you one? I have one anyways. I'm going to say regardless. But if you have one, you can say it. I know a lot of people don't want to. I cringe every time. Sometimes I have somebody come on and tell a joke to some kids and that, but I don't have one for today.
Well, I did think about this because you didn't mention it to me yesterday.
Yeah.
And it's a very short and sweet, very quick. I'm not
perfect.
I assume that this will work internationally. But how do you spell hungry horse in 4 letters? MTGG.
Perfect. So I want to tell you this. So I've got one to add to this, and then we'll close out. So when I was growing up, this is a true story. When I was growing up, my very first joke I ever told my parents, and I remember it vividly. I can see my parents sitting at the kitchen table, and I walked up to my parents. I was probably 4 or 5. This is the level of my jokes, by the way. I walked up to my parents and I said, I've got a joke. And my parents would look at me kind of stunned and they go, you've got a joke? And I go, yeah, I got a joke. And they said, okay, what is it? And so the joke was, who goes to bed with their shoes on? And my parents are looking at me. And the answer is a horse. That's my joke. Anyways,
Love it.
Raleigh, thanks so much for being on. I really, really appreciate it. I love your story. I'm telling you, I'm glad I asked that question about, what you would have changed. For some reason, it resonates with me. I think it just says everything it talks about, really bringing it down to the simplest term, really, at the end of the day. But really, Raleigh, thanks so much for being on.
Not at all.
Well, thank you so much. And then for everybody else that's out there listening, several things. One is, if you've got a better joke and you want your kids or a friend or whatever to tell the joke, please do, because the guest and myself, we hate telling these dumb jokes, but we also love it. So if you can do that, send me an email at mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. Or if you got a great subject that you want to get out, a message that you think like a story like this needs to get out, please send me an email and I'll get back to you. I promise I will. But most importantly, for everybody that's listening, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, for real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.